In 1874, 6 men set off into Colorado's San Juan Mountains in the middle of winter with the hopes of reaching some newly discovered goldfields on the other side. 2 months later, only a single man emerged from the mountains, but instead of being emaciated as early explorers were often later found, the man looked to be weirdly fed. This is the story of Alfred Packer, also known as the Colorado Cannibal. As a quick note, although the descriptions of the events in this video are fleeting and non-descriptive, they are still disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. On the morning of April 16, 1874, the men who worked at Los Pinos Indian Agency near Saguache, Colorado, were sitting and eating breakfast when the mess hall door suddenly flung open. In the doorway, surrounded by howling wind and a fierce snowstorm, was a man disheveled and clearly distressed. He had rags over his feet instead of shoes, a long beard, a coffee pot hanging from a strap on one side, and a rifle over the other. After standing there for a second, he began to beg them for help. This man's name was Alfred Packer. General Charles Adams, who oversaw the agency, got his men to help Alfred to a table with some food, and because he was starving, ate so quickly that he threw up. Then, over the first of many whiskeys, he told them about his horrific journey over the mountains. He explained that the others with him had become too exhausted to continue, that he got snow blindness and frostbite, and he'd been left behind to fend for himself. For months afterward, he'd eaten rabbits, roots, and rosebuds, and it was only his experience as a guide that got him out alive. Several months earlier, when the party that Alfred eventually joined set out from Bingham Canyon in Utah on November 20th, 1873, they were part of a group of 20. They didn't know each other initially, except for the fact that they all wanted to be rich. This group was traveling to the newly found goldfields near Breckenridge in Colorado, which was a place where the newspapers claimed anyone with any sense could make a fortune. And in fact, when they started out, Alfred wasn't actually with them. The group happened to bump into him south of Salt Lake City, about 25 miles into their journey. Alfred asked them where they were going, and they told him they were heading for the goldfields. Alfred then offered his services. He claimed he was a guide and knew the territory between Utah and Breckenridge well. At first, they weren't sure about him because he seemed a little odd, but they thought having someone who knew where they were going was helpful, so they agreed to take him on. Unfortunately, Alfred actually had no idea where he was going, and to call him only a little bit odd was being nice. However, he wasn't lying completely. He had worked as a guide for a few months, he just wasn't very good at it. He had a habit of getting lost and tended to get into arguments with his clients. He also had a reputation for stealing from people and lying, so those who knew him either didn't like him or didn't trust him, or both. When he was younger, Alfred served in the Union Army during the Civil War and enlisted twice, but his service only lasted a few months each time because he had epilepsy and was prone to seizures. This led to him being honorably discharged both times, and after being discharged, and in addition to being a guide, for a time he was employed driving horses and other draft animals across the West. He also worked as a hunter and a range hand, and even did odd jobs for mining companies. He even tried mining in Colorado, but unfortunately, none of these jobs lasted long because he had such a bad attitude. No one could trust him, and he was constantly getting fired. In any case, after offering to be a guide to the group in 1873, Alfred would manage to get them as far as just outside Montrose by getting lucky. But this first 260 miles or so hadn't been easy either. A couple of winters earlier, parts of the western and midwestern US had been hit by the lowest temperatures on record. 1873 wasn't all that much better either, and the journey from Utah to Colorado was tough and slow. The trail they were following was covered in heavy snow, slowing down the wagons and making it almost impossible to stick to a path. They followed a compass for a while, but eventually got lost anyway, and then by January, they were completely out of food. This forced them to begin eating horse feed and even thinking about eating the horses themselves. And if that wasn't bad enough, they had to put up with Alfred. They would later describe him as greedy, lazy, and constantly fighting with someone. By then, too, it was obvious that he wasn't the seasoned guide he claimed to be. A few weeks later, on January 21st, most of them had all but given up when they stumbled across the camp of a Native American band known as the Utes, led by a man named Chief Ouray in a valley just outside Montrose. Contrary to popular belief, relations between Native Americans and prospectors weren't often hostile. So even though the men looked terrible, or possibly because they looked so terrible, Chief Ouray gave the men food and offered them shelter. He even suggested that they stay with him until the weather got better. And the group knew that the next part of the journey would be just as challenging. They still had roughly 120 more miles and the San Juan Mountains to cross. To make matters worse, the weather hadn't improved by February. Chief Ouray even told them that no Ute would try to make that journey in those conditions. It would be certain death. The safest thing to do was to accept the chief's offer and wait the winter out. Unfortunately, they were also worried that other groups would get all of the gold before they got there. They were just one of many groups who were making the trip in search of riches. So, after a meeting, the group decided to leave half the party behind to look after the horses and wagons till spring. At the same time, the other half would try to make their way to Los Pinos Indian Agency. Chief Urey realized there was no way he could talk them out of it, so he gave them some directions to help them get over the mountains in one piece. He said the best bet was to drop down to the Gunnison River and follow it before going north to the agency. Alfred, on the other hand, was insistent it would be better to cross the mountains directly rather than going around. He claimed he knew that area and that way was a lot quicker, and for some reason, 5 of the men believed him. The chief then gave each of the groups food, and then the group that didn't have Alfred in it set off along the river. And just as the chief had warned them, the journey was brutal in the cold. The freezing winter made following the river difficult, and the food they had ran out long before they reached the agency. They would have even starved to death if they hadn't been found by some cowhands working in the area. These men then fed them and let them stay with them at their cattle camp until spring. In April, when the weather improved, these 4 men finally made their way to the agency and got there in May, and to their surprise, Alfred had already been there and left, but only Alfred. None of the others had been with him. According to the expedition's leader, after leaving the Ute, Alfred's party followed the river on horseback until the horses couldn't get any further. The leader then offloaded their provisions and walked the horses back to the Ute camp. It's thought that they continued to walk down the river a bit further and then took a path high into the mountains. Importantly, when the leader dropped them off, he knew they didn't have enough supplies to get to the agency, but he'd just had enough of arguing with Alfred. Afterward, they only had about 14 days of food and nothing they needed for a winter hike in the mountains. Their clothes weren't adequate to keep them warm, and they had no snowshoes or flints and hardly any matches. They only had a few rifles, 1 pistol, a hatchet, and some knives. After the expedition lead turned back, no one heard from any of these men again until months later when Alfred burst into the mess hall at the agency. And from the beginning, something seemed strange. Alfred told the workers he was starving, but by the look of them, he'd been eating quite a lot of rabbits and rosebuds. They'd seen men trapped in the wilderness before, and they were usually all but walking skeletons. They typically didn't show up with a bloated face and a well-fed belly like Alfred had. When Alfred claimed to be feeling a bit better, he headed to the nearest town, which was Saguache. While he was there, he got himself a room in a saloon and spent over $100 on drinking and gambling. That's around $3,800 in 2023. Then he spent another $78 in the general store, and when he drank, he often gave conflicting stories about what had happened. Some people even said that he had a different wallet every time he went out, and he never seemed to run out of cash. He'd sold his rifle when he was back at the agency, but all he got for that was $10. It didn't explain the rest of the money. He didn't even seem to be any good at gambling. Preston Nutter was the man who arrived at the agency in May, and he was the leader of the other party that followed the river. After leaving the agency, he also went to Saguache in search of answers, and probably because he already knew Alfred was a liar, Preston was immediately suspicious of Alfred's story. He told General Adams that there was no way the other men would have left him for dead. The rifle he'd sold belonged to an old man who was with Alfred's group, and the pipe Alfred had left behind was owned by another one of the men named Shannon Bell. In addition to all of that, when Alfred originally joined the group, he had no money. Following this revelation, the general sent a man on horseback to get Alfred and bring him in for questioning. When Alfred got back, the general and his men wanted to know where Alfred had gotten the money. They also wanted to know why he had some of the other men's things and how he'd managed to not only survive the mountains, but to turn up well-fed. In response, Alfred first claimed that he'd gotten his feet wet and cold and had to stay by the fire while the others went to look for food. When they didn't return, he assumed they'd abandoned him. To Preston, though, the story made no sense. The other men were prospectors. Even if he wasn't a great guide, he was better than no guide. Eventually, a council was formed to get to the bottom of everything. Then, right as the meeting was starting, 2 members of the Ute tribe arrived at the agency with pieces of flesh, which they claimed came from a human found on a hill close to the agency. Upon seeing this, Alfred panicked and then fainted, and then when he woke up, he begged for mercy and as he sobbed, told a different story. Before beginning, though, he was reported as saying, quote, "It would not be the first time that people had been obliged to eat each other when they were hungry." Alfred then went on to explain that 10 days into their journey, they'd run out of food. The oldest man had died first, and because they were all so hungry, the others ate him and took his rifle. 5 days later, another man died, they ate him as well. They also went through his pockets and found $133. Not long after that, another man who was with them died, but Alfred wasn't there when it happened because he was getting wood for the fire. The remaining men then ate him too. Soon after that, the owner of the pipe, Shannon Bell, shot the remaining man. Then, he and Alfred carried some of him with them for food on their journey and then covered up the rest. 2 weeks later, Shannon tried to kill him too. Alfred claimed that Shannon went mad and attacked him, and so in self-defense, Alfred shot him. Then a little while later, he managed to stumble into the agency. General Adams had this full confession written down, and he made Alfred sign it as a sworn statement. Obviously, Preston didn't believe any of this. He was sure that Alfred had killed them and stolen their things. It got so heated that at one point Preston dragged Alfred outside, and if others hadn't intervened, he would have killed him then and there. After the scuffle was broken up, Alfred was arrested for manslaughter and imprisoned in a log cabin owned by the sheriff of Saguache. When summer came, General Adams took Alfred and some of his men into the mountains to try to find and retrieve the bodies, but they couldn't find anything, so Alfred was returned to his cell. Later in August, while Alfred was waiting for trial, an illustrator named John Randolph was traveling over the mountains. As he came down a pass to reach Lake City, he walked by a tributary of the Gunnison River close to the spot where Alfred had previously claimed he'd left Shannon. There, he noticed something sticking out of the ground. Immediately, he was hit by a terrible smell, but if the stench was hard to take, what he saw was even worse. He found 5 men, each in a different state of decomposition, and it was clear they'd all met violent ends. One of the men was little more than bones, as if animals had gotten to him afterward. 2 of the men had clearly been hit in the head with something blunt, and another man who was identified as Shannon Bell had been stripped to the bones except for his hands and feet. It was clear he suffered a blunt force injury to his head as well. From what remained, it was fairly clear that there was a deliberate removal of the edible portions, and apart from the first man, it didn't look as though this was done by animals. Upon stumbling on this horrific scene, John stopped to make a sketch of it, and then he continued on and told the authorities in Lake City. I won't show the sketch here, but it is still available online. A little while later, a team of 20 volunteers set off and retrieved the bodies. Upon examination, the coroner was sure they'd all been killed by a blow to the head while they were asleep. None of them had any defensive wounds or injuries, and they all had similar markings on their skulls. Other evidence only made things worse for Alfred. All the men had rags over their feet, meaning they were probably hungry enough to have eaten the leather in their shoes when they ran out of everything else. There was also a track to a makeshift shelter, leading them to speculate that maybe Alfred had killed them for their possessions, got stuck there when the weather turned bad, and then eaten them to survive. Because of these findings, it was expected that Alfred's charges would be upgraded from manslaughter to first-degree murder. However, before this could happen, someone slipped Alfred a key, a penknife, and some food so he could escape. To this day, it's not clear exactly who was responsible, but either way, at some point, Alfred slipped out of his cell and wasn't seen again for 9 years. In 1883, one of the original prospectors who stayed the winter with Chief Ouray a decade earlier had set up a shop selling supplies in Cheyenne, Wyoming. On March 11th, a man approached him looking to stock up for a planned trip and introduced himself as John Schwartz. To the man, John seemed familiar, and for a second he thought it might be the same John Schwartz he'd spent time with at a Native American camp all those years ago. But when he looked again, he realized it wasn't John, it was Alfred. After the interaction, the man went on to tell the local sheriff he spotted a criminal, and Alfred was eventually arrested and taken to Denver. General Adams then traveled up to confirm it was Alfred, and after he had confirmed it, he took him away for trial, and he asked Alfred once again what had really happened all those years ago. This time, Alfred came up with what would be his final story, one he more or less stuck to until he died. When Alfred's group left Ouray's camp, they didn't have anywhere near enough food. The amount was basically only enough for a single grown man to eat for a week. Then on top of that, after 2 or 3 days, they were hit by a brutal snowstorm. They continued to trek through this until they got to the base of a mountain. Then beyond that was a deep valley, but on the other side of the valley, the snow was so deep they could barely walk. This forced them to get to higher ground, and already by day 4, they only had about a pint of flour left. For the next 10 days or so, they lived only on rosebuds and pine gum as they followed a ridge to stay out of the deeper snow. Apparently, several of the men were in rough shape by then and would cry out every night and pray to God, hoping they could escape the mountains alive. Eventually, they came over the main ridge and descended and camped by a river. They followed this stream for a day until they reached a lake, possibly Lake San Cristobal, that at the time was frozen over. They decided to cross the lake to where a few trees could be used for shelter, and by then they were exhausted and tensions were rising. And while some of the men were desperate and breaking down, Shannon Bell was feeling something different. He was furious. He was mad at Alfred for getting them lost and at the others for how pathetic he thought they were acting. And then one morning, Shannon was acting stranger than usual. According to Alfred, it seemed like he either had a plan to survive or was going insane, or maybe both. That morning, he told Alfred to go out on his own and explore higher up the mountain to see if there was any way of getting across. So Alfred took a pistol and set off, but all he found were steep slopes and more snow, both of which weren't very helpful. He would even admit to the general for the first time that although he was kind of a guide, he didn't really know what he was doing, and he didn't know that side of the mountains. It took him all day to scout ahead and come back, and then when he got back, he found Shannon sitting by the fire, eating a piece of meat. Alfred then stopped and looked around, and he could see a man lying there a little ways from the fire, and it was clear what had happened. Then he looked back toward Shannon and saw the other 3 men lying around the fire not moving. Then he slowly approached the fire, and upon noticing Alfred, Shannon rushed at him with a hatchet, but he managed to shoot Shannon in the stomach before he could reach him. Alfred then finished him off after he fell to the ground. Later that evening would be the worst night of Alfred's life. In a letter written later, he asked if anyone could imagine how he felt that night. In his own words, he was surrounded by, quote, the midnight horrors of starvation as well as those of utter isolation. He also claimed he felt like he was losing his sanity, and he started to understand what happened to Shannon because it was beginning to happen to him. In another letter, he even said, quote, the greatest wonder is that I ever returned to a rational condition. The next morning, he tried to follow his tracks from the day before, but between the snow and the exhaustion, he was forced to turn back. So next, he made a small shelter out of wood and branches to keep warm, but that didn't do anything to satisfy his ever-growing hunger. The group had spent enough time out there already for him to know that hunting wasn't a reliable source of food. So eventually, in complete desperation, he picked up the piece of meat Shannon had been eating, cooked it for a while, and then bit into it. Almost right away, the horror of what he was doing was overcome by the relief of eating food, and he knew what he had to do to survive. He would then go on to spend another 2 months there in the little shelter, surviving off the rest of his party. 60 days later, he spotted an avalanche that left yellow clay behind. This was an indication that he'd been in an area known as Slumgullion Pass, which is known for its yellow color and was named Slumgullion because it reminded early settlers of Slumgullion stew. So finally, now in early spring, Alfred had an idea of where to go and set off up the mountain again. Before he did, he gathered some of the remaining meat and wrapped it so he could eat it while he walked. He also checked the pockets of the other men before he left, which is when he found the money he later spent in Saguache. And like the others, he'd already eaten his shoes, so he wrapped his feet in cloth, and sometimes he had to stop because his feet began to freeze. When that happened, he stopped and lit a fire to warm them. Then when he got close to the agency, he ate the last piece of meat and possibly dropped some, which were later found by the Ute. He also admitted that when he went out with General Adams' search party a decade earlier, he took the men as far as the mountains opposite the camp and did all he could to stop them from going further. He claimed that he really did want to take them further to show them the truth, but even more than that, he didn't want to go back and be reminded of the horror he'd been through. Alfred also told them that the reason that he'd escaped and ran from trial was because he feared that a mob might get past his guard and kill him. He'd already nearly been killed by Preston Nutter, and so he thought sooner or later someone would finish the job. After escaping, he went to Arkansas using a fake name and worked on a ranch before eventually moving on to Arizona and then finally traveling to Cheyenne where he was found. And that's the story that Alfred consistently told until the day he died. When his trial finally began, there were several parts of this story that were called into question. In particular, people were convinced that everything was deliberate and premeditated. It was thought that he had deliberately led the men astray with the intent to steal their possessions by any means necessary. His harrowing survival story afterward was just an attempt to cover up his actions after the crime. The prosecution would end up bringing in witness after witness to support this idea. Some of them were part of the original group of people who set out from Utah. One of them was Preston, who testified that Alfred was always trying to find out how much money they had. Other witnesses were brought in to testify to Alfred's behavior after he got to Saguache and the different accounts he told of the events. Then when Alfred finally took the stand, his testimony didn't help his case either. He rambled on for 6 hours and admitted to eating the other members of the party, but swore that he only killed Shannon. Shannon was responsible for everything else. After all the evidence was presented, the jury would go on to find Alfred guilty of premeditated murder, theft, and several other charges. He was then sentenced to be hanged for his crimes. Before that could happen though, Alfred's lawyers discovered a technicality. Colorado became a state in 1876, and prior to its statehood, Colorado Territory didn't have a statute under which he could be tried for murder. It wasn't until after the crime had taken place that Colorado State established the specific laws for which he was being tried for. Because of this, the conviction was overturned and he had to be retried for manslaughter instead of murder. In this new trial, Alfred again pled not guilty and stuck to his story, but this case was even more damning for him. The prosecution brought in hunters who said there was plenty of food where they were, even in a bad winter. Game, rabbits, deer, and plenty more would have been easy to hunt, even by someone as inexperienced as Alfred. They even went as far as to claim that the cannibalism had to have been by choice because food would have been so plentiful in the area. In addition to that, it was argued that at the very least, even if he wasn't some malicious monster who premeditated the whole thing, he did still lead the group astray by hiking that more dangerous route in the winter under the guise of being a guide. In the best case scenario, he was extremely negligent, and so he was eventually found guilty of voluntary manslaughter. For this conviction, he received 40 years in prison, which was the maximum of 8 years per man. At the time, this was the longest prison sentence handed down in US history. After being imprisoned, Alfred wrote to anyone he could, claiming the sentence was unjust, that he'd only killed Shannon, and that the jury was full of biased and prejudiced people. Eventually, Alfred's story got to a woman named Polly Pry. Polly Pry was a reporter for the Denver Post, and unlike most people, after hearing Alfred's story, she kind of believed him. Because of this, she began to use her position as a reporter to try to help him. She would end up writing stories about him, making him out to be a man of the people. She claimed he was just an ex-soldier who had been persecuted by the establishment and was someone who was just in the wrong place at the wrong time and survived the sort of horrors that most of us couldn't imagine. She claimed his sentence was only so harsh because of the cannibalism, but anyone would have done the same in that situation. And incredibly, over time, her stories made such an impact that local businesses started to arrange petitions for his release. Then, finally, after enough pressure, the Colorado governor paroled Alfred in 1901, just 18 years into his sentence. In the over a century since the story took place, several different groups have done separate forensic analysis of the remains and compared them to Alfred's account of what happened. The conclusions of these groups have tended to lean in favor of Alfred being guilty, with some showing defensive wounds on some of the bones of the group, contrary to what should have been there if Alfred was telling the truth. Like, for example, one group found marks across the forearms of Shannon Bell, which indicate he may have defended himself from an attack. In Alfred's account, Shannon was only shot once and then finished quickly. At the same time, there also seems to be some evidence that corroborates Alfred's story. In 1994, an 1862 Colt revolver was found at the site of the murders. It was still loaded with 3 .38 caliber bullets, and these bullets matched some fragments of lead found in Shannon Bell's hip, suggesting that at least part of Alfred's story may have been true. After prison, Alfred at least seemed to be a changed man. He went on to work at the Denver Post as a guard for a while, and people described him as kind, modest, and even charitable, far from the grumpy, greedy, and untrustworthy guy he'd been in the past. He eventually moved out to a city known as Littleton, where he bought a copper mine and went back into prospecting. He eventually died in 1907 at 65 years old, and rumor has it he was a vegetarian when he died. I would take that with a grain of salt, however. So what do you think happened? Do you think Alfred was telling the truth? In some ways it seems so clear he was lying, but in others maybe not. Although he had a bad reputation, it's quite a big jump to go from petty theft to what he was eventually accused of. Was he really capable of what is thought to have happened in those mountains in the middle of winter, or was he just a victim of circumstance? Let me know down in the comments what you think happened. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.